Mr. Kent, you're completely out to lunch. Where are you going? Where are you going? Next, it's going to be Israel was behind the Civil War. It's just so completely lunatic, and they all believe it.
That was Norman Finkelstein reacting to the MAGA Civil War, reacting to figures like Joe Kent, who has recently resigned from the Trump administration in light of the recent escalations against Iran. Escalations that, in his estimation, are being done at the behest of Israel. And I must say, I find his reaction to be very disappointing. And this is in spite of the fact that Norman Finkelstein is somebody who I greatly admire. Somebody who has heroically stood up to the bullying of Zionists throughout his entire career, who has heroically stood up and said that what Israel does to the Palestinian people is wrong. And there is a lot of truth in the frustration that he is feeling. What we may call dissident MAGA, these extremely influential and well-connected conservatives, have broken with the foreign policy establishment of the United States, have broken with institutional conservatism and the donor class behind them in a huge way. But in doing so, they have attached themselves to a worldview that is often conspiratorial and leads itself to making claims that can't be substantiated. Claims around the September 11th attacks that I can't verify. Claims around the Kennedy assassination that I can't verify. And if there's anybody who would know, it would be somebody who is well connected within intelligence, like Joe Kent. But in addition to that, figures like Candace Owens have also engaged in some rather unhelpful historical revisionism. Moreover, Norman Finkelstein is not an activist. He's an academic, and his background informs his opinions. Academics are going to be more concerned with what they can verify, with credibility, than they are going to be with maneuvering among social forces and trying to change the world. And we have to understand that before we go dogpiling on somebody like Norman Finkelstein. But his comments are endemic of two major problems with the way that even quote-unquote anti-imperialist leftists think about politics. First of all, there is an unfortunate anti-populist attitude that accompanies a lot of leftist politics, especially since the hippie counterculture. And second of all, there is a major issue with the framing of issues and an inability on the left for leftists to break with orthodox left-wing explanations for global events. For years, when it comes to affairs in the Middle East, the standard leftist answer when it comes to Israel is that it is simply an outpost of U.S. imperialism, without any agency of its own, like Turkey or like Saudi Arabia. This excerpt from the Trotskyite newspaper of the Socialist Workers' Party of Britain says it best. Quote, "Today, the Israeli tail does not wag the dog of U.S. imperialism. To suggest Israel can manipulate the U.S. dog to favor it over Arab states makes little sense." Leftists will then go on to compare the treatment of the Palestinian people to the genocide committed against the Native Americans in the United States and their treatment, with the final argument being that Israel is an evil settler colony, just like the United States, and just like Americans are all bad people, Israelis are also bad people, and so that if you hate America, you should hate Israel too. Now, in response to questions about official narratives, about things like the USS Liberty, or the attacks on 9/11, or the Kennedy assassinations, or even lobbying groups like the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, the response is to list a bunch of atrocities committed by the United States and say, see, the United States does bad things, so you shouldn't pay attention to any of that. Now, this sort of messaging is effective when the majority of the population was dismissive of anything that challenges mainstream narratives. When the majority of the population would have dismissed any criticism of Israel at all as being anti-Semitic. But as the majority of the population wakes up, as the majority of the population opposes the war in Iran, opposes what Israel does to the Palestinian people, and has questions about things like AIPAC and the amount of money that they funnel toward our politicians and the preferential treatment given to Israel, such an explanation falls completely flat. It's essentially saying to the American people, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? Now, it is true that Israel operates within a broader imperial apparatus, and that it was largely created by Britain through the Balfour Declaration to be a military base for the United States and earlier for British imperialism. Joe Biden said it best when he said,
"Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region."
But it is also true that Israel is a state that has its own interests, separate from the broader long-term interests of U.S. imperialism. And that Israel gets special treatment even among other outposts. Israel is not South Korea. Israel is not Japan. Israel is not Germany. Israel is not Colombia. It is illegal for a U.S. citizen to serve in the military of any foreign power. And by serving in the military of any foreign power, you are giving up your U.S. citizenship. That is, of course, with the exception of Israel. Moreover, what conservatives like Joe Kent or Tucker Carlson are speaking to when they talk about the United States being captured is a feeling that has taken root among the American people and is very real. And that is a feeling that America has lost its sovereignty. A feeling that our leaders are not acting with our best interests at heart. And they're right. They're right that our leaders are not loyal to the American people, but to the interests of a global system that dominates the world through banks, cartels, and syndicates. We have leaders that are not loyal to their constituents, but to their donors. They are loyal to Wall Street and to the City of London, and to an international financial system that also includes outposts like Israel, which have their own interests and exert outsized influence. So when Norman Finkelstein and others, because he's not the only person saying things like this, says things like,
There's no evidence, and I've studied it very closely. There's no evidence that the U.S. went to war against Iraq at Israel's behest.
they are saying something that not only do the American people feel in their bones to be untrue, but also, from an activist perspective, is completely counterintuitive, especially if you are an advocate for socialism. Because a society where the banks, factories, and industries are collectively owned and organized according to a central plan is the only way for us to get out of this situation. And such societies have always come into existence as a result of a national liberation struggle. By this, I mean a struggle of the people for sovereignty and control of their countries against the powers that have subordinated them. Not out of a struggle necessarily between employers and employees, nor from some abstract moralistic struggle against the bad things that their country had done. And this is the case in every country that has broken free from the Western financial system. It is most obvious in countries like Vietnam, or the Sahel states that come out of a struggle against French imperialism, or countries like Korea or China, which come out of the struggle against Japanese imperialism, or Cuba or Iran, and the dictators imposed on them by the United States. But even the most classical, quote-unquote, Marxist revolution, the Russian Revolution, comes out of a national liberation struggle, not strictly out of a class struggle. This, too, is out of step with your standard leftist Marxist orthodoxy, which argues that because Russia was a European power at the time of the February and October revolutions, that it, too, was an imperialist power, as Lenin said, a prison house of nations. But Russia was never imperialist in the same way that countries like Britain or France or Germany were. This is an analysis increasingly popular today in Russia and in China. the school of what is being called geopolitics, which points out that societies of the land, like Russia, fundamentally operate different from societies of the sea, like Britain, and that land empires engage in more mutual development and have different relations, whereas sea-based empires revolve around control of trade routes and keep their imperial periphery poor. But one doesn't even have to leave the school of Marxism to see economic analysis that corroborates this. Rosa Luxemburg, the German Marxist intellectual and communist originally from Poland, said this at a conference held by the Second International in London in 1896. She commented about the then very trendy Marxist demand for Polish independence and voiced strong opposition to it, saying, "The Russian Tsardom derives neither its inner strength nor its internal significance from the subjugation of Poland. This assertion in the resolution is false from A to Z. The Russian Tsardom derives its inner strength from the social relations within Russia itself. The historical basis of Russian absolutism is a natural economy resting on the archaic communal property relations of the peasantry. The remains of this backward social structure, and there are many such remains still found in Russia today, along with the total configuration of other social factors, constituent on the basis of Russian Tsardom. The nobility is kept under the Tsar's thumb by an endless flow of handouts paid for by taxing the peasantry. Foreign policy is conducted to benefit the bourgeoisie, with the opening of new markets as its main objective, while customs policy puts the Russian consumer at the mercy of the manufacturers. Finally, even the domestic policy of the Tsardom is in service of capital. The organization of industrial expositions, the construction of the Siberian Railroad, and other projects of similar nature are all carried out with a view of advancing the interests of capitalism. In general, under the Tsardom, the bourgeoisie plays an inordinately important role in shaping domestic and foreign policy, a role which its numerical inconsequence would never permit it to play without the Tsar. This, then, is the combination of factors which gives the Tsardom its strength internally. So it continues to vegetate because the obsolete social forms have not yet completely disappeared, and the embryonic class relations of a modern society have yet not fully developed and crystallized. Again, the strength of the Tsardom abroad derives not from the partition of Poland, but from the particular features of the Russian Empire. Its vast human masses provide an unlimited source of financial and military resources, available almost on command, which elevates Russia to the level of a first-rate European power. Its vastness and geographic position give Russia a very special interest in the Eastern question, in which it vies with the other nations that are also involved in that part of the world. At the same time, Russia borders on the British possessions in Asia, which is leading it toward an inevitable confrontation with England. Now, what she is pointing to is the fact that though Russia had the means to compete as a European power, it was not acting as an imperialist power in the Leninist sense of the word. Its economy was primarily agrarian in nature and resembled what Marx would have called the Asiatic mode of production, where property is collectively owned and managed by a state, but in which the forces of production remain relatively stagnant. Imperialism emerges out of monopoly capitalism, capitalist crisis, and financialization, and Russia was not in a position to be imperialist in the Leninist sense of the word because forces of production had not developed in such a way, but that forces within Russian society were managing Russian policies in ways that were not in the interest of the majority of Russian people. The argument against the Tsar was not that he was a big, strong, mean guy who was oppressing the people of Dagestan or of Kazakhstan or of the Ural region, although I'm sure there was a lot of inequality, as exists in all societies which are in a state of underdevelopment. But the argument against him was that he was weak, and that he was allowing Russian policy to be managed not in the interest and on behalf of the Russian people, nor even on behalf of the nobility, but rather on behalf of a tiny minority of people who were not loyal to Russia, but were loyal to the British financial system. That Russia, in the process of its so-called modernization during the Tsarist period, was losing its sovereignty and increasingly becoming an outpost for British profiteers. Donetsk, for example, was originally settled by Welsh industrialists, and intended to be an outpost for the British in the region. Even the Tsar was not enough of a puppet for the comprador bourgeoisie, who felt that he was mismanaging World War I, a war meant to renegotiate the colonies amongst the European powers, a war which Russia had been dragged into against the interests of the Russian people on behalf of the British, which is why they ousted him in February of 1917 and replaced him with the puppet Alexander Kerensky. And it was by finally overthrowing the provisional government headed by Kerensky and establishing the Soviet Union that under Lenin and later under Stalin, Russia was able to finally assert their sovereignty and their independence. What the folks within dissident MAGA are tapping into is the same frustration and struggle that the Russian people dealt with. They know intuitively that we are not in control of our government, and that our leaders are not loyal to us, but to an economic system, and sometimes even to foreign powers. There is also a powerful counterexample of what can happen in such a situation where the masses feel in their bones that their government is not working for them, or that they have been subjugated, where anti-imperialist forces have failed to act properly. In Weimar Germany, there was a split between forces led by the Hamburg faction of the Communist Party of Deutschland, Heinrich Laufenberg and Fritz Wolfheim, and the rest of the party. After the First World War, Germany had been stripped of its colonies, had lost much of its territory, and was being forced to pay exorbitant debts to British and French banks that were bankrupting the country. Laufenberg and Wolfheim argued that under these circumstances, Germany no longer constituted an imperialist power, and that the struggle for socialism in Germany would also be a national liberation struggle against British imperialism, which had indebted Germany. They sought to form an anti-monopoly coalition that would, include the working class, as well as the middle-class elements and the patriotic bourgeoisie against the comprador bourgeoisie, and build socialism on the basis of an alliance between these classes in the interests of the German nation, as would later be done in China. But this was a minority position within the Communist Party of Germany, and the Hamburg faction, the so-called National Bolsheviks, were expelled, accused of ultra-leftism, syndicalism, and Luxembourgism. And the Nazis, who were actually the foot soldiers of the very same comprador bourgeoisie, the German monopolists like Krupp and like Tyson and like Hallermer-Schacht, who were keeping the German people subjugated and poor, were the ones talking about the national resentments that the German people felt, and ultimately used this to take power, to crush the Communist Party of Germany, and commit numerous atrocities, as well as marching the German people into the disaster that was the Second World War. As Stalin pointed out, the supposedly National Socialist Nazi Party was neither nationalist nor socialist, engaging in no collectivization and leaving Germany in ruins. But had the KPD been able to properly give voice to the feeling of humiliation and subjugation that the German people felt, something like that may never have happened. But they couldn't, because they clung to Marxist orthodoxy rather than rising to the needs and the consciousness of their people. It is so desperately important that we learn from these lessons, because what we need more than ever in this country is an anti-monopoly coalition. What we desperately need in this country is a mass movement of ordinary people that speaks to the truth that the American people feel in their souls, and that is that the interests of Wall Street, The interests of the city of London, and yes, the interests of Tel Aviv, are not the interests of the American people. That the system of globalism, imperialism, is foreign to the American spirit and has its boot on the neck of the American people. Dissident MAGA, be it Joe Kent, or be it Candace Owens, or Tucker Carlson, or the millions of people who listen to them, is such an important constituency because they represent a significant group of people who recognize that America needs a national liberation struggle and who are screaming loudly that they can no longer stay cowed and beaten before the feet of institutional conservatism. They can no longer cringe meekly at the feet of the establishment while their fellow Americans get poorer. And yes, they are deeply confused. And yes, they have a conspiratorial worldview. And yes, they do not fully understand what it is needed to reassert our independence. But it is the duty of anti-imperialists not to mock them, not to speculate on their intentions and nitpick their political line, but rather to help them to understand that what we need is a government of action that fights for working families. That we need a government that works in the interests of working people, and yes, facilitates commerce and empowers people to start businesses and enriches communities. We need to help them to understand that there is a new economy emerging in the world centered around the BRICS countries, and that the only future America will have is by joining with that new economy. I am part of an organization that seeks to do that. It's called the Center for Political Innovation, and if you're interested, there will be a link in the description. Thanks for watching.